Greetings, my name is Autry and I am completing this video as a requirement for Module 2, Unit 2, Assignment 3. And I am covering school policy, national policy in the United States that has impacted teaching and learning in the classroom across the nation. The three policies that I'll be looking at as a requirement for this activity are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, aspects of the No Child Left Behind law that was implemented in 2002, the Every Child Succeeds Act of 2015, and I also want to touch on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and even a Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. The main focus of this video will be to look at segregation and discrimination in the classroom, the impact that these policies have had on leveling the playing field between groups that are experiencing historical disparities in terms of health outcomes, educational outcomes in this nation. Starting with the Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown v. Board of Education was a ruling of the Supreme Court which said that separate but equal was unconstitutional. So the Brown v. Board of Education actually overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which allowed for state-sponsored segregation. This ruling was actually the beginning of creating a public education system in the United States, one that really sought to educate all children. Fast forward a decade later to 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark piece of civil rights legislation that outlawed discrimination in this nation based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application for voter registration, and ultimately it ended racial segregation in the classroom. This was actually a federal law which made it illegal for schools to be segregated. Another push towards desegregation of public education. And this was in fact enacted, called for by President John F. Kennedy, 1964. The following year, 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed as a part of Lyndon Baines Johnson's War on Poverty, and it has been the most far-reaching federal legislation affecting education ever passed by the United States Congress. This act created public funds for primary and secondary education, and it was also heavily focused on equal access to education and created high standards and accountability. The bill really sought to shorten the achievement gaps between students by providing each child with a fair and equal opportunity to achieve and have access to an exceptional education. As mandated in the Act, the funds are authorized also for professional development, instructional materials, and resources to support educational programs, including programs that seek to get parents more involved. The reason I selected this act is because it's the first time now that the federal government created funding to support learning for those students from impoverished communities. So again, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education was a Supreme Court ruling. 1964, the Civil Rights Act made it a federal law, forbidding schools and other public accommodation institutions to be segregated, and it began really the push for equal opportunity to educational services. Again, at the time, segregation was a system where things were separate and not equal. And so the ESEA followed in that trajectory of creating a public space for learning and righting some of the detriment of the history of this country, namely the transatlantic slave trade, which actually set up a lot of the health and educational disparities we continue to see in this country to this day because of unequal distribution of resources. The No Child Left Behind law was a reauthorization of the ESEA 1965 Act. And the No Child Left Behind law effectively scaled up the federal government's role in school accountability and student outcomes. So under the NCLB law, states were required to test students in reading and math while they were beginning in grade 3 all the way through grade 8 and once they entered high school. And they were also required to report the results based on subgroups. So English language learners, students in special education, racial minorities, and students who are from low-income families. States were also required, and this is the key and pivotal point of this law for me, because this is the aspect of the law that allowed for students or the confounding of impoverished neighborhoods and poor academic outcomes. Essentially, schools were required to ensure that their students reached 100% of their students reached a level of proficiency by the 2013-2014 school year. If they were not able to meet their yearly progress, or if they were not making adequate yearly progress, they were penalized. And after 3 years of failure to make adequate yearly progress, schools were in danger of being closed. So many schools in urban environments and impoverished districts that serve primarily students of color were faced with closure, and actually this is what spearheaded the charter movement that we are now seeing across the nation. Charter schools were born out of the No Child Left Behind law because it created space for them to take over public education services. We are witnessing the privatization of public services in a variety of sectors. The privatization of public services in the education sector are charter schools, and it is the No Child Left Behind law that created the opportunity for charter schools to get involved in the provision of educational services. So students in impoverished neighborhoods were actually penalized under the No Child Left Behind law, and it was a very invasive federal law. And now we're with the ESSA, which seems to try and give states back some of their autonomy and to really focus on getting students ready for the future, supporting them in graduating, improving those graduation rates, reducing some of the emphasis on testing and penalizing schools for not meeting proficiency level, and focusing more on holistic student engagement, parent engagement, teacher engagement, and other types of targets that would really help educators focus on the whole child. So this is the end of my report, and I hope it has been highly informative.